Welcome back to the program. As we saw earlier, a partisan divide's emerged in Australia over how we should be dealing with China. The Prime Minister says China is now a developed country. The opposition leader says it's not. Anthony Albanese says we should be engaging in more military cooperation with China. The government says we're doing enough already. Joining me now is Michael Shoebridge from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute to look at some of these, well, differences. Thanks for your time this afternoon. I want to start on whether China's a developed or a developing country. Now, one of the difficulties here is there's no actual agreed definition on what makes a country developed, but the most common scale is GDP per capita. I've got a list here of, the latest report from the International Monetary Fund from last year. Just to give you a bit of a sense here, at the top of the list is Qatar. We can just bring them all up if that's okay. You can see that China still sits well below the richest economies. We come down here to China, there it is, at just over $18,000, but well above the poorest countries. It's roughly around where Thailand, Barbados, Dominican Republic sits. The difficulty, Michael, with this measurement when it comes to China is that, well, it is the second biggest economy already. It's such a big country that you really do have two economies going on there.
Exactly. It's like that Dickens book, Tale of Two Cities. You know, there's a two-track economy in China. There is a highly developed Chinese economy with high technology, hundreds of millions of people living at middle-class standards of living comparable to Australia.
And if you took just those cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, so on, you'd say absolutely that's a developed economy.
That's right.
But then you've got the rest of the country.
And the way that the Chinese economy and the Chinese state is engaging with the world economy is through that developed economic sector, those hundreds of millions of people at middle class and luxury standards of living. So from an international trade point of view, the part of the Chinese economy that matters is the developed part of that economy. And that's the point I think the Prime Minister was making.
Well, it raises an interesting question. I mean, there's no doubt, and everyone points this out, that hundreds of millions have been lifted from poverty through China's economic growth. It's been a miraculous and wonderful achievement in terms of changing those lives and changing the global economy. But is it doing enough to share its wealth between those two economies you talk about?
Well, firstly, China hasn't done this on its own. It's been lifted by its engagement with other world economies, Australia's, the US and the European Union's. But as a communist authoritarian state, it's chosen to use its newfound wealth very strangely, and that is to grow its military, economic, political, cyber and intelligence power and to use those assertively against its own people and against other countries and people.
You're saying it's not a very communist way of doing things. It would be more communist to use that wealth to lift faster those regional areas out of poverty.
Its own citizens. So President Xi is under mounting criticism from Chinese people who are saying, why are you sending hundreds of millions, billions of dollars offshore to invest in the Belt and Road Initiative? Why aren't you looking after people here at home? Same kind of dynamic you'd expect here in Australia if that
And what is the answer to that? Why then is China spending billions of dollars on these Belt and Road Initiatives, including in the Pacific, instead of investing in its own people?
Because the authoritarian leaders of China, President Xi and his Politburo colleagues, want to grow their global power. They want to grow their strategic, technological and economic power, and they don't mind doing that at the expense of the remaining hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens that are still living in poverty.
We should explain why this is more than just a technical argument, whether China is considered a developed or a developing country. It particularly affects what it's allowed to do with trade barriers, right?
Exactly. So depending on what your status is, the kind of commitments you get obliged to meet under things like the Paris Climate Change Treaty or World Trade Organization rules change. And you get more free passes the lower down the rung on undeveloped, developing, highly developed you sit. So at the moment, let's take an example like the 5G debate and 5G technology. Huawei turns out to be in the middle of this discussion now because by Chinese state practices and policies and under existing WTO rules, China has subsidised and protected Huawei, let it grow its protected home market with 1.4 billion people, And now, because of those subsidies and that protected home market and intellectual property theft, it's able to offer really low prices on the world stage. Well, that's not competitively fair, and it's putting all other technology firms that don't have those protections at a global disadvantage.
But let me ask you this. Anthony Albanese's taken a different view on whether China is now a developed country, but he's also been critical of Scott Morrison for making this speech in the United States, in Chicago. Is this the sort of thing the Australian Prime Minister should be saying while in the United States?
Well, firstly, I don't know why Mr Albanese wants to come to the defence of the Chinese Communist Party in saying that it's an undeveloped economy. Clearly, it's the second largest economy in the world and it has burgeoning high-tech capabilities. But then on the issue of where an Australian Prime Minister makes a speech about international trade and economics, I think a real test for a speech is, could our Prime Minister give exactly that same speech in Beijing, in Chicago, in Tokyo, in Port Moresby, in Canberra or Rockhampton? And the speech that he gave in Chicago, he could give in all those places.
So the consistency is something that should be applauded, you're saying?
Yes, it's about the content of the message, and he would be able to give exactly that same speech in Beijing, and that is a hallmark of a good speech.
What do you make of the fact that we are seeing, particularly today, particularly this week, such a partisan divide now over this, over how to treat China, whether to regard it as developed or developing, and indeed whether, as Anthony Albanese says, we should be playing a stronger role in easing some of the tensions between the US and China?
I think the idea that Australia can be some kind of bridge over troubled waters between China and America is nonsensical. They have a much deeper connected relationship than requires marriage counselling from Australia.
We can't help, you don't think?
I think we have to pursue our own national interests in this.
But isn't our interest to lower the temperature?
Well, I think there's not as much of a bipartisan split as people might think. Penny Wong was making some points about the need for multilateral cooperation for economic reform that would make these kinds of changes that Scott Morrison set out. And she was talking about not having a binary debate around US or China. So I think there's more to play out on whether or not the Labor Party actually thinks differently, because they'd be out of step with every G20 leader, except for Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, in seeing the reform path for the global economy that Scott Morrison sketched out.
And let me ask you about what Anthony Albanese said today in relation to military cooperation with China. He's pointed to the cooperation that does exist in some peacekeeping in, I think it's Sudan, but he said we can do more, we can go further. What do you think?
I think we'd have to have a very clear-eyed view about our objectives. Cooperation with the Chinese military that has any shred of building their military capability, simply not in our interests. In fact, this has come up with a number of our top universities who've cooperated closely with PLA scientists on things of direct warfighting interest to the Chinese military. That's not in our national interest, certainly not in our national interest for our defence organisation, whether it's members of the ADF, members of our acquisition or strategy organisations, to assist Chinese military planning and capability. We are seeing how they're using their capability in the South China Sea to take other territory claimed by other countries, and it's not in our strategic interest to help them project their power into the South Pacific.
But if, I mean, China's military has grown a lot and it's going to continue growing a lot no matter what we do, if we are required to work together on natural disaster relief and so on with our two militaries, don't we need to prepare for that?
That's why I'm saying let's be clear-eyed. Right. So anything that advances their military capability or their ability to project power is not in our interests. You can quarantine cooperation around humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and you can have confidence-building measures so that there aren't miscalculations and misunderstandings.
But we shouldn't be training, sharing technology, equipment, anything like that?
Not at all. The PLA will never share a tactic, technique or procedure that would be advantageous to the Australian military. They will not share their defence technology. Why would we be silly enough to do the opposite?
Michael Shoebridge, Director of the Defence and Strategy Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks very much.